just to hammer this point home, the reason why you have to respect the law if you fully understand it is because it really does embody, for Kant, the very concept or idea of rational action. Or in other words, this idea that that human beings act for reasons, whereas other things don't. So Kant's very impressed by this idea. Every object in the world obeys rules, but only human beings get to pick which rules they obey. So now, as a human being, of course, I don't get to pick to obey the rule of gravity, the law of gravity, but I do get to choose whether to drive the speed limit or to tell the truth or to follow any of the other rules which are laws which exist out there, show up on class on time, etc. Other objects in the universe just obey laws. They don't get to choose which laws to obey. So in the recognition that we ought to obey the moral law, we are expressing the very concept of freedom of the will, of real free autonomous action by recognizing, the moral law is that which ought to guide my behavior. An animal can't do that, Kant thinks. Dogs never get to see what's so fantastic about universal moral laws. Neither, of course, do they get to see what's so fantastic about the law of gravitation. Neither do they get to see what's so fantastic about the laws of logic or arithmetic or mathematics or calculus. They just can't see that, and it's reason which allows us to see it. And so it's reason which is going to not only allow us to see why the truths of mathematics are the way that they are, but also why the moral realm is the way that it is. So again, what's being developed here is this, as we go through this, I don't want you to lose sight of this very long, complex argument that the foundation of morality is reason in the real sense that you find it in logic, namely detection of contradiction. Okay, so let's examine this idea closer. So first we got to say what a maxim is. We've got to say what it means that you could will it to be a universal law. And then we're going to provide some examples of how this is done. So a maxim for Kant is simply something like a description of what the person is doing in such a way that the person would approve of it. So, for instance, if you are asked a question about whether someone looks fat in a pair of jeans or not, and you say what is false and what you know to be false, that they don't look fat in those jeans, then we can say that the maxim you endorse is that when asked awkward questions, it is appropriate to lie in order to save a person's feelings or to avoid a confrontation. So there's a little policy that you have. I mean, you may not be explicitly thinking about it, but if someone were to put that question to you, oh, so you think it's okay to lie to save someone's feelings or to avoid a fight, you would say yes. So a maxim is just the thing that the person would assent to as a description or general description of what it is that they're doing. Now, that's not overly precise, but that's about as good as we get out of Kant's writing. Now, the categorical imperative works on maxims, so you need to have this kind of description. And generally what you're doing is you're sort of taking this general personal rule that this person has. They're saying, look, I think this is okay. In these kinds of situations, it's okay to tell a lie. Then what you're doing then is asking what the world would be like if everybody followed the rule that you have in mind. That's what it means to universalize the maxim. So what would the world be like if everyone thought that it was okay to lie in these kinds of circumstances? Would there be some kind of problem? Now, in particular, when we're thinking about these possible worlds, where your maxims are universal laws of nature like the law of gravity, people don't have a choice now. You're sort of just imagining. Everybody lies all the time to avoid any kind of conflicts. They lie for any reason that they think is appropriate, because really that's what this maxim amounts to in the universalized case. You're saying, well, look, in this case, I think it's appropriate to avoid conflict, so to do something that I think it's morally permissible. I mean, excuse me, to promote some good which I think is important, I can say something which is a lie. So in a world where everybody acted that way, what would happen? Well, of course, everyone would be lying. But Kant's not interested, strictly speaking, in the consequences of the action. Rather, what he's interested in is whether or not there's a contradiction in the world that we're imagining. If we detect some kind of contradiction in the first instance, then we know automatically, right off the bat, this action that we're describing with the maxim is immoral. So before we get into the case about lying here, think of this, just think about this in terms of physics. Suppose a person were to tell you that it was a law of our world that an object could be in two places at once. Well, you might say, what would the world be like if that were a law of physics, that any object could be in two places at once? Would there be a contradiction in that world? Well, yeah, the world would be full of contradictions because, for instance, it would be the case that you're wherever you are right now, but also somewhere else at the same time. Now, that's just Kant thinks it couldn't be true. So there can't be a law of physics which says that two objects, sorry. There can't be a law of physics which says that one object can be in two locations at the same time. You can just rule that out by noticing that there would be a contradiction in that world. So too, when one thinks about a world where people lie in order to promote something that they think is good, there's also a contradiction. Namely, that a person wouldn't even be able to lie in such a world. Lying crucially depends on other people accepting what you say as true. But of course, in a world where everyone was lying for whatever reason, nobody would ever accept anything that anyone said as true. So the very thing that you're thinking about doing, lying in order to avoid a conflict, the very thing that you're thinking about doing would be impossible in a world where everyone followed the rule that you're following. So imagining that everyone acted this way shows you, Kant thinks, that the thing that you're doing is contradictory and therefore irrational. Now, as a rational creature, you can't endorse that the world be contradictory in nature. And so here you are suggesting that there be this universal moral rule, that it's morally okay to act in this way. But that results in something that's contradictory. So you can't endorse it. You can't tell a lie, even when you think it's going to be for the best. You can't make that the case. Now, this is something that Kant talks about in a lot of different places. He says, look, if you ever think about it carefully when you're about to do something that you to violate one of your duties. So you're about to tell a lie, you're about to steal some printer paper from work or something like that. You sort of think to yourself, if you were to be honest with yourself, Kant thinks, you think to yourself, well, gee, I recognize that I don't think that everyone should act this way. But in this particular case, it's okay. So you try to make an exception of yourself to this universal moral rule. So no person who steals thinks that, stealing is good, everyone should steal. Rather, usually what they think is that in this case, the circumstances merit that I should steal. Right, and that's sort of what the no rule absolutist, someone like Aristotle, that's what they're going to say. That if the virtuous person decides or comes to the conclusion, in this case, stealing is something that should be done, then that's okay. If the virtuous person comes to the conclusion that in this case lying is good, then that's the good action. It's the one that the virtuous person performs. But Kant is here saying, no, 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 that can't be right. That in some cases lying is good, and in other cases lying is bad. Because the moral commands don't admit of these kinds of exceptions. And you're basically saying then, well, these things that are universal in nature can have exceptions, and that's irrational fundamentally in its nature, Kant thinks, to say that moral laws have exceptions. None of them have exceptions. Now, there's a complication here that we need to bring up at this point. So there really are two different ways of getting a contradiction. And so, correspondingly, two different kinds of duties. So there's the first kind, which Kant calls perfect duties. And perfect duties are the ones that result from a contradiction straightforwardly, like the one we've just been talking about. And we'll give examples of these, so don't worry. But then there are also what he calls imperfect duties, because there are some things that you can imagine coherently without contradiction. But when you think about it, you can't really want the world to be that way. So just to take a non-technical example, the book talks about gas-guzzling SUVs. So think if everyone drove a car which got 5 miles to the gallon, what would the world be like? Well, it'd be smoggy, chaos, fog pit. Now, it doesn't seem like there's any contradiction there, technically speaking. But could you really want the world to be that way? Is that a world that you could really want to live in? Well, Kant thinks, no, we can't really want that world to be, our world to be that way. But there's no technical contradiction. It contradicts some kind of inclination at a basic human level. And this gives rise to what Kant calls an imperfect duty. Imperfect duties are sort of, they're still duties, but they're less impressive than the perfect ones because they depend on some unique feature of human nature. And if that feature of human nature were different, our imperfect duties would be different. Whereas the perfect ones depend only on our rational nature, and so are better. Even if there were an alien sponge life form, if it had reason, it would be obligated to tell the truth and not lie. But it might not be obligated if it lived on a different world, in a different planet, with different desires and different biology. Gas-guzzling cars wouldn't be an issue for it. So that depends on specifics around here, whereas telling the truth doesn't. Just has to do with the notion of what's logically consistent. And it's not logically consistent to think that you could have a world where everyone was simply lying when they thought it was okay, because then no one would be able to lie. So there's a contradiction there. Okay, so let's illustrate this with an example that Kant talks about. Now, he actually talks about promise keeping, and this is a similar kind of example to the lying one, but dealing with promises. So, and this is good because this is Kant's own example. He doesn't do the lying one that we just talked about, lying when one thinks it's appropriate. He does this promise-breaking one, which involves a lie. So, suppose that you need money. And suppose that what you do then is, say you're short on your rent, right? So you're thinking to yourself, gee, I'm really kind of screwed here because I'm $350 short on my rent. My landlord's going to kick me out. What am I going to do? Well, suppose you know that your friend has the money. Okay? So now you think to yourself, how can I get this person to give me that money? I know, well, I'll ask them to borrow it. And the person says to you, well, sure, I'll loan you the money, but I need you to pay me back by the end of next month because I'm going on a trip and I need this money back. Now, suppose you think to yourself, well, gee, there's no way I'm going to be able to pay him back by the end of next month. But that's okay. I'll just tell him that I will pay him back. So, because I need the money. So the only way I can get him to give me the money is to tell him what he wants to hear. So you say, I promise. I promise I'm going to pay you back. Even and you think to yourself, well, I'll explain to him later or something like that. Okay, so you promise to repay him the money even though you know you can't do so. Well, remember, to use the categorical imperative, first thing you got to do is formulate the maxim. So what's the maxim in this case? When I need money, I will borrow it and promise to repay it even though I know I cannot do so. So if someone were to stop you and say, so wait a minute, you think it's okay to promise something even though you don't intend to keep it? You would have to say yes, because that's what you're doing. You think that that's okay. So now the next thing you do then is to universalize that maxim. What if everybody went around making promises that they didn't intend to keep? What would the world be like? Would there be a contradiction? Now, would there be a contradiction in this scenario? Well, Kant thinks, yeah, of course there would. Why? Well, think about it. In this world, it's a law that people promise to do things that they never intend to do. So every promise that's made is one that the person doesn't intend to keep. Is that a world where people can even make promises? No, there can't be any promising in a world where people don't really think you are. So think about our ordinary world analog of this. If you are bouncing checks all over town, no one will take a check from you because they don't believe that you have the money. Checks only work if they believe you. So too, saying I promise to do something only works if people generally believe that you're going to keep your promise, that promises are kept, that there's something to it. Once people realize that there's nothing to it, words are cheap. It's only if it's honored that promising can continue. So in a world where everyone was acting the way that you're thinking about acting, in other words, in a world where people made promises they never intended to keep as a matter of rule, the very thing you were trying to do would be impossible to do. So in that world, people are promising because we describe it as one where you make a promise. But of course, no one can be promising in that world because everyone realizes that you aren't really promising when you say that. So it's a contradiction there. You have someone who says they're promising, so that's usually how you promise. But they can't be promising because nobody takes them at their word. So in that world, it's impossible to promise. That's a contradiction because what you say you're doing is promising. So breaking your promises, making promises that you don't intend to keep is contradictory. It's irrational to make a promise that you don't intend to keep. It's immoral to make a promise that you don't intend to keep. And more generally, it's immoral to lie, right? So we've seen already so far two basic duties derived from the categorical imperative, from just thinking about what's logically consistent and what isn't logically consistent. Somebody who thinks that it's appropriate to lie is irrational because they endorse basically a universal rule which allows there to be contradictions. And Kant just thinks that at our nature as rational beings, we can't endorse that. Okay. So you have a perfect duty to keep your promises. You have a perfect duty not to lie. Not to do so is irrational. Now notice, of course, that this is very, very, very important. Kant didn't say, well, if everyone went around breaking their promises, society would break down. There would be terrible consequences for us and the environment, etc. That doesn't matter to him. He doesn't care about the consequences. What matters is that when we describe this world, we describe something that entails a contradiction. So we describe a world where people are promising, but where they can't be promising. And so we literally end up with something that is contradictory. It's not that there are bad consequences in this world. That's irrelevant for determining whether there's a perfect duty or not. What matters is whether or not the maxim is contradictory when universalized, because it's a requisite condition on any moral rule that it be universalizable. That's what the categorical imperative tells us. You have to be able to say consistently, everyone should do this. But of course, what Kant thinks is that when you are lying, or when you are stealing, or when you are murdering, you don't think everyone should do this. You think, no, and that's not the case that everyone should do this. I just need to do it right now. Which, of course, is the essential characteristic of acting immorally, he thinks. Now, so I say, notice here, the same reasoning gets you to the conclusion that you ought not to lie. It's the exact same reasoning. We've already been over that. But just to re-emphasize that point, when one lies, one hopes that the person believes what one says. That's the point of lying. You want the other person to think that it's true. But in a world where everyone did that, no one would ever think that it was true, and so no one could lie. So the very act of lying, then, is irrational and self-contradictory at its very nature. Okay, now, that establishes that it's immoral to lie. And so, according to Kant, just like there are no circumstances under which 2 plus 2 is 4, or under which something is both true and not true at the same time, so also there are no circumstances under which it's morally appropriate to lie. Period. End of story. That's, unfortunately, says Kant, just the way that it is. Well, this brings up something which has been discussed a lot in the history of moral philosophy, and that's the murder at the door, so to speak. So even in Kant's own time, common criticism of him was the following scenario. So imagine what I sometimes refer to as the Terminator scenario, right? The Terminator's there. It's a person. They want to kill a certain person. You know where this person is. They're upstairs doing your laundry, baking cookies for you, something like that. And the murderer says, where's this person? I want to shoot him in the face. Well, you know where they are. What are you supposed to do? Well, as we've already discussed, people like Aristotle judge that, well, in these sorts of circumstances, it certainly seems that the right thing to do is to lie, right? When the Nazis are looking for Anne Frank, you ought not to tell the Nazis where she is, even if you know. If they ask you, you should lie to the Nazis and say you don't know where she is. But Kant denies that that's right. He says, look, nope, that's wrong. It's always wrong to lie. There are no circumstances under which it's morally permissible to lie. Now, Kant is aware that people find this counterintuitive. They say, wow, that's so strange. You ought not to lie even to save a person's life? Yeah, that's right, Kant thinks. So, and it goes back to his view about consequences, which we talked about earlier. The consequences of the action aren't in your control. You don't have control over the consequences. They don't matter for determining the moral worth of an action. It's solely whether you're motivated by your moral duties. And one has a moral duty to be honest, not to lie. So even in this circumstance, when dealing with the murder at the door, one has a moral duty to be honest, not to lie. So even in this circumstances, it's wrong to lie. Now, Kant says, suppose that you did lie. Say that the person is upstairs as far as you know, and so you lie and say, oh, the person has gone home. They're not here, they're at their house. Now, you think that's a lie, so you're lying to the person. But suppose, unbeknownst to you, the person has snuck out of the upstairs room and fled to their house, and you have sent the murderer straight to them. Well, in that case, then it would have been bad to lie. You should have told the truth and said that the murderer to the murderer that the person was upstairs. They would have went up there and they wouldn't have been there. You could have swore, well, they were here, blah, 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 blah. But since you lied, you sent the murderer right to the person's door. So how are you to know what's going to happen when you tell this lie? You should do what's morally right as far as you can tell by a priori reasoning. Lying is always wrong, because if everyone did it, the truth itself would be impossible, it would be devalued, and lying itself would be impossible. It's contradictory. So now, if this person then is bent on committing murder, that's their fault. You shouldn't take responsibility for their sins. You have a moral duty. The moral duties you should prescribe for you, telling the truth. Now, so does this murderer. The moral duty he has not to take an innocent life. And Kant thinks there are no circumstances under which it's morally permissible to murder someone. To take an innocent life is morally wrong under all circumstances. So this person has a duty. They're not following it. So that's their problem. They're going to have to deal with that. You have your duties, and you can't control this person. So, and you can't control the outcome of your actions. So what you should do is do what's right, what's morally commendable, and that's telling the truth. Even if you think the circumstances are unbearable, that's irrelevant. You have a duty to do what's right, and the good person is the one who does what's right. Now, that's, of course, highly counterintuitive. Lots of people disagree, and that's understandable. But nonetheless, Kant's giving an argument here, and this is his position. And so, again, it's not always important that you agree with these people. What's important is that you're able to see what the arguments are and why they think what they do. And then you're able to, when we get to the utilitarians, we'll have some counterexamples and arguments. And so then you'll be able to argue against this. But for now, you need to understand this was Kant.